It's now a great pleasure to announce our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Daniel Drezner, who will speak on Autocrats, Plutocrats, and Datacrats. Are democracy and governance as we know them doomed? Let me briefly say a few words about Professor Drezner. He's a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's also a prolific writer and contributor to the Washington Post, and his latest book, The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas, was published last year. Professor Drezner, we're delighted that you accepted our invitation to speak today and very much look forward to your keynote. Please join me in a warm round of applause for Professor Drezner, please. Hello.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank God. I'd be quite helpless without this. Thank you very much to ESPIS for inviting me. I believe I only have 30 minutes and probably put too many slides, so I will try to speak quickly, and I apologize for my rapid American manner of speech. So we're supposed to be talking about what the future looks like, and I do have some experience in terms of trying to predict the future. At least in terms of reading how others try to predict the future. And I recall back many years ago when I was an undergraduate starting to take courses in economics and political science, the sort of lessons we got in the introductory courses were very reassuring. The idea was that if you took Economics 101, you learned about the way that the market was supposed to work, particularly the ideal way that the market was supposed to work, the notion of perfect competition. And the notion of this was that if any corporation started making too much money, you would just have new market entrants go into that market, and that would immediately reduce the possibility of profit. Furthermore, the possibility of corporations getting too big was surely to be laughed at because there was a law of diminishing marginal returns. So there was no benefit necessarily to becoming too big. In fact, if anything, there were inefficiencies emerged. And similarly, with respect to politics, the idea was the notion of electoral competition meant that it was impossible for one single party to dominate, that eventually you would have some sort of reaction to it, and that furthermore, liberal democracy, particularly as practiced in the West, exercised a very powerful rule of law. The notion is there were powerful constraints on the ability of political actors to do what they would want. And this also rested, presumably, and among other things, trust and expertise in the bureaucracy and in the marketplace of ideas to generate new ideas or to attack bad ideas. And the notion in both of these cases, in sort of introduction to political economy, is presumably that both economics and politics would cause failures to fail. That bad economic ideas and bad political ideas would die because eventually they would be rejected. So now we fast forward to now, and the world looks slightly different than when it did when I was an undergraduate. We, as it turns out, now have the rise of things like big tech. We have many sectors where you can point to increasing returns to scale rather than decreasing returns to scale, which in fact incentivizes a sort of winner-take-all philosophy. You have clustering effects where it turns out that it's very difficult to replicate things like Silicon Valley elsewhere. And you don't have nearly as much economic convergence both within countries and between countries as was previously expected. And in terms of politics, it doesn't seem necessarily like bad ideas have failed. In fact, if anything, bad ideas have gotten more popular. And the notion that there would be a sort of expertise or set of experts that would potentially correct these things has been reduced to little more than cries of fake news. And we have seen massive amounts of erosion of trust in authority and expertise, which certainly prompts the kinds of anxieties that triggers conferences like this one. And instead of having a marketplace of ideas, we have shifted to something that I like to call the ideas industry. So, to summarize this, we have a tale of two Fukuyamas. The one that was talked about in 1989 or 1992, in which it turned out that everything was moving in a relatively more virtuous direction and would be happy to be living in a world of liberal free market democracy, to one in which he is now talking about the concept of political decay, that as it turns out, the very institutions that he was extolling 25 years ago might have a few bugs in the system and need to be reformed somewhat. Let me suggest that what I've just talked about refers to the two different ways that we can predict the future. The sort of simple, and it's not one is right or one is wrong, but rather these are two natural habits. When you ask about what the world is going to look like in 2030 or 2035 or 2050 or 2048 if you're the Chinese, 2049, there's one of two stories you can tell. The story that I think is dominating today's conversation is one of extrapolation, which is to say we take a look at how trends have occurred over the last 5 years, and those trends are not good if you're a fan of liberal free market democracy. And just say, well, let's project going forward. That we can see the rise of populist nationalism, we see no reason why that's going to wane. We see the rise of authoritarian capitalism, we don't see why that's going to wane. All of these sorts of trends that generally speaking are not beneficial to Western civil society aren't going well, therefore we are headed towards even worse place. Let me suggest, however, that there is another way you can think about this, which is equilibrium, which is to say that when you see the rise of these kinds of trends, that also automatically triggers counter effects. And so it's possible that what we are seeing now is not necessarily trends that I would necessarily welcome, but it also triggers, to use an epidemiological metaphor, it also triggers its own antibodies, which is to say that as these things emerge, you also see, counter reactions to it. And it's worth asking whether or not those will be the fundamental things that will be driving. So the current extrapolation obviously is the one of autocrats and plutocrats and populists, all leading to bad outcomes. And I don't need to belabor this point because I think that's in some ways the theme of the entire conference. And lurking behind all of that is the notion that somehow big data, and more importantly the abuses and exploitation, or the word of the day, weaponizing big data, is rendering these kinds of civil societies and other virtues that we find somewhat unhealthy. And that's certainly something to be concerned about. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about sort of what these trends mean in particular for the United States, but certainly one of the questions is whether autocrats such as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are weaponizing these kinds of vulnerabilities in Western civil society. I'm not going to talk too much about that, although I'd be happy to take questions about it, except to suggest, if this is a safe space, to point out that if Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are weaponizing these things, to be blunt, they are pushing on an open door, which is to say, to blame Facebook or to blame troll farms for the erosion of trust and authority and expertise badly misunderstands what is the source of that erosion of trust, which is to say, it turned out that societies in the West were already distrustful of these things. All the sort of, troll farms and other kinds of misinformation did was simply push the door open a little bit further. But it's not like this is a unique thing to 2016 or, more recently. These efforts have been going on for decades. The question is, why did they succeed now, whereas they had failed previously? And indeed, this sort of symbolizes the transference, you can argue, from liberal democracy potentially to populist nationalism. So in the book that I wrote last year, I would say that part of the reason the door got open is that there have been three trends, particularly in broader society, that have essentially made the marketplace of ideas function not quite in the same way that it used to. The first and most important is, in fact, the erosion of trust and authority and expertise. So this is from, I see Bruce Stokes right in front of me, so I had to quote Pew at least once during this talk. This is the Pew data on trust in government in the United States from 1965 to, or from, sorry, 1958 to 2015. None of this should be terribly surprising, which is to say, back in the 1960s, there was a very high degree of trust and authority. Subsequent to the Vietnam War and to Watergate, that trust plummeted dramatically. There was a seesawing in that amount of trust until the September 11th attacks, at which point you saw the last great surge of trust and authority, and then ever since then it's just been a total cratering effect. And I could show this poll or these kinds of numbers for any other institution in the United States. With the exception of the United States military, trust in every other institution in America has plummeted badly. And the problem is that if you don't have this kind of trust in authority and expertise, then anyone can become an authority or an expert on something. Indeed, I believe this morning Donald Trump, in an interview in the Washington Post, described himself as one of those few people that has exceptional intelligence but nonetheless does not believe in climate change because he's apparently so exceptionally intelligent. But the point is that this generally causes the rise of people who can say anything or do anything and, as Mr. Timmerman said, come up with any kind of crazy conspiracy theory and nonetheless gain adherence because no one is necessarily weighted an expert as knowing more than someone else. The second trend, at least in the United States, is the rise of political polarization. To sum up the trends of the last 50 or 60 years, Democrats have moved somewhat to the left, and Republicans have moved way, way, way to the right. And it's not just among party elites, although it's concentrated among there. If you look again, at the sort of median Democrat and median Republican, you've seen a relative shifting. Which say the median Democrat has moved to the left and the median Republican has moved to the right. Now, there are a variety of possible explanations for this, some of them pernicious, some of them far less pernicious. But the more disturbing aspect of this is that as you've seen a rise in polarization, you've also seen a rise in, for lack of a better way of putting it, the demonization of the other. Which is to say, you can argue that now, if you are an elite Republican or elite Democrat, you don't want your children to marry outside of your political persuasion. Which is somewhat problematic. And indeed, there's been experiments done by political scientists that show that, in fact, partisan Republicans and partisan Democrats are more likely to discriminate in terms of hiring based on political ideology than things like race or gender or sexual orientation. So in some ways, political ideology has become the last legal form of discrimination in the United States. And again, this is problematic for the marketplace of ideas and for the functioning of democracy. Because if someone comes up with an interesting idea or someone comes up with a valued criticism, if it turns out they are identified very clearly as being on the left or on the right, it becomes equally easy for people on the other side to discount it. If I, as a professor, go on television and say, I think that the president is making a mistake with respect to climate change, I don't think he realizes the concerns that are coming out there, someone can just go on Fox News and describe me as an out-of-touch, elitist, coastal academic. And there's more than a grain of truth to that accusation. And so as a result, this becomes problematic in terms of me or others trying to push back on bad ideas. And this also leads to a real problem in terms of perception, which is if you have strong degrees of political polarization, you can be exposed to the exact same set of facts and nonetheless come away with radically different interpretations of what those facts mean. Now, this can be either trivial in the form of this dress, which was a viral thing a couple of years ago in terms of what the color was, and there were very vigorous disputes about that. But to put it in a slightly different way, we can say what you would infer from this picture, all right? To many people, probably in this room, this is a picture in which Donald Trump looks like he's isolated. It looks like he's, alone at a G7 meeting in which everyone else is putting pressure on him. To Trump and to his acolytes, this is an example of a president standing fast in the face of, pressure from others, from these Europeans that don't know what they're doing, and therefore it's him as a strong leader. The fact that you can have such radically different interpretations over just a simple photograph suggests that it's going to be extremely hard to build consensus on other issues. The last important trend, in some ways the most important, is the rise of economic inequality, both in the form of income and wealth. This is concentrated in the United States, but I would add that all three of these trends also exist in Europe to a lesser degree. So to sum up, life has been very, very good for the 1% over the last 30 or 40 years. But if life has been good for the 1%, life has been super awesome for the top 0.01% of the income spectrum. That it's not just that you have income inequality or wealth inequality, that it's been further concentrated at the top. And one of the problems is that these people who wind up doing well, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, wind up living in a very stratified sort of kind of intellectual life, where simultaneously it turns out if you have more money than you know what to do with, what you want to do is go back to college. But you don't go back to college because you've got a lot of money. What you do is create your own college, or rather create your own intellectual salon. Or you attend other intellectual salons, whether it's TED or Davos or what have you. And the problem is that you wind up only consorting with people who are very, very much like yourself. Which is to say, if you're a billionaire and you only hang out with other billionaires, you wind up having the same set of beliefs, and those beliefs are somewhat disturbing. And furthermore, the degree to which you wind up thinking that in some ways almost any problem in the world is simply a piece of faulty code that can be hacked or bypassed somehow, much in the same way that you believe that the government can be dealt with in the same way. And so people were talking about algorithms, so I'll just let you read this. And it winds up in one of these kinds of situations where you truly believe that you can solve almost any problem through technocratic means rather than relying on votes or the consensus of civil society or what have you. And as a result, in this kind of world in which there is a low degree of trust, in which there's low levels of consensus, in which you have plutocrats who can fund their own sort of idea centers, you wind up with ideas as asset bubbles. Ideas, the sort of marketplace of ideas winds up functioning, unfortunately, very much like financial markets. You might have the germ of an interesting idea that might emerge. That idea might have some, credibility to it, but it winds up getting applied so broadly and so far beyond its original origins that it winds up being a disaster. And I think the word disruption is a perfect example of this. Has this affected politics? Yes, you could say it's affected politics just a wee bit. In particular, if you take a look at the preferences of plutocrats or the preferences of the very well-off, this is from a paper that surveyed high net worth individuals in the United States. It turns out that high net worth individuals in the United States have public policy attitudes that are far more libertarian than ordinary citizens. Which is to say, high net worth individuals in the United States generally believe that the state gets in the way far more than it helps. And so as a result, they want the state to play far less of a role in terms of public goods provision, in terms of regulation, and so forth. And this matters because it turns out that the plutocrats have far greater contact with elected officials than ordinary citizens. These are the sort of, again, surveys in terms of the degree to which the plutocrats have contacts with members of Congress or with the executive branch. In case you're wondering, the median response by ordinary citizens to all of these questions is 0. They don't have any access whatsoever. So this demonstrates the sort of asymmetry when it comes to these kinds of things. And in some ways, increasingly, the sort of current move towards populist nationalism is actually a challenge for the 1%, because the 1%, as I said, is very libertarian. And so they're facing a world in which the right seems to be moving far more towards populist nationalism, whereas the left seems to be moving far more towards economic populism, and they don't like either of these outcomes. And they can throw as much money as they want at the problem, but they can't necessarily persuade people to change their minds on this. So in this world, and this, to some extent been a decline, you can argue, particularly on the left, of this notion of sort of third-way Democrats or third-way social democrats. And indeed, it's been replaced by economic populists. And this is not necessarily healthy, because the problem is that when populists are asked to choose between populist nationalists on the right and economic populists on the left, they're going to choose the populists on the right every day of the week and twice on Sundays. And the reason is because if they can do that, they will at least get the economic goodies that they want. They will get tax cuts. They will get deregulation. They will get, at least in the United States, an extremely corporate-friendly judiciary that will side with them. And while they are not thrilled with things like protectionism or broadsides against immigration, they can live with those things if they get the corporate tax cuts. That is a trade-off they are willing to make. Whereas with economic populists on the left, there is no trade-off they can make. If they deal with those people, they have to deal with the notion of much higher corporate taxation and a much more aggressive federal government intrusion into their operations. And so they will always pick the right in that scenario, which is not a healthy outcome. So, as a result, who is happy? Generally speaking, the plutocrats on the right, who can sometimes exploit these populist nationalists to pass things like the tax cut that happened in the United States in 2017, which lowered corporate rates and lowered individual rates, and if you were a member of the 1%, should be supremely happy with that outcome, because you got the lion's share of those benefits. So, the long-term extrapolation for all of this is not good. As a result of this, you have a situation in which productive entrepreneurship, the kinds of innovation that we generally think of as usually being relatively good, can be replaced by what the economist William Baumol referred to as unproductive entrepreneurship, which less polite terms would be rent-seeking or corruption, in which corporations or high net worth individuals will simply use more money to exercise political influence, particularly over the right, to get the kinds of things that they want that enrich themselves, rather than investing in broader public goods. Furthermore, the very fact that these corporations benefit tremendously from having right-wing populists in power means they will double down on that strategy, which means they are not going to abandon, at least in the United States, the GOP anytime soon, because they need them to stay in power. Because if they lose power, then suddenly all these corporations will actually lose a fair number of benefits and see their stock prices go down. And so as a result, you wind up with a doom loop of what Martin Wolf of the Financial Times referred to as Pluto-populism, an unholy alliance between the sort of populism, the Steve Bannons of the world and the Donald Trumps of the world, in which you simultaneously claim to be speaking for the working man while you cut taxes for the 1%. So thank you no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to end it on that. That's, as I said, the sort of extrapolation story, which might make you think that this is not necessarily the way the world is going to work. Let me suggest, however, that we might also be reaching the apex of that, and that rather than this being an extrapolation, this rather might be a cycle. And we're, in fact, about to see the wheel turning. And here I'm going to focus particularly on the United States because I am not, although I am an arrogant American, going to lecture you about Europe in Brussels as an American. I do know a little something about the United States, however, so I'll try to say how I think this has gone over, at least in the United States. I think one of the things to realize is that, this is the sort of average polls from 538 about Donald Trump's popularity, and it is worth pointing out that despite, without question, by surface measures, the best economy, the healthiest economy in the United States in at least 20 years, if not, according to Donald Trump, all time, Donald Trump is a remarkably unpopular president. And again, if you grade it against the economy, if I told you in the abstract that the United States was currently an economy that with less than 4% unemployment, higher than 3% economic growth, and less than 2% inflation, and asked what would the approval rating be, you would assume at a minimum it should be more than 50%, probably closer to 60%. The fact that Donald Trump is polling in the low 40s is not a sign of his political good fortune. It's a sign of his political incompetence. And this is worth remembering. And in fact, if you take a look at what happened most recently in the 2008 midterms, despite the extremely healthy economy, as it turned out, Donald Trump and the Republican Party did very badly in terms of these elections. You're now talking about a 40-seat gain in the House of Representatives for Democrats, at which point the Democrats control the House. You saw a small GOP gain in the Senate, but given the nature of the Senate landscape, actually they were expecting to do better, I think, and did, as a result, mostly held serve. And what should really concern the GOP is where they lost, which is namely the Rust Belt states, which is the place where Trump actually did surprise everyone in 2016. But most importantly, he lost everywhere that was not a rural place. In both urban and suburban sectors, the GOP got trounced and they got beat surprisingly badly, even in places that they had traditionally dominated prior to 2018. And what should scare the GOP is that in states where they have traditionally dominated for decades, they came very close to losing. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to lose in 2020, but it means they're going to have to play defense there in a way that I don't think they had necessarily anticipated before. So again, despite presumably all the factors that I talked about that should cause the right to do really well, it's worth pointing out that Donald Trump is not actually doing terribly well politically. And indeed, what is particularly striking to me is the degree to which on the very populist issues that Donald Trump has run on, which is namely immigration and trade and a rejection of alliances, the American public has actually shifted in the exact opposite direction from where Trump has argued. So this is the Gallup poll with respect to immigration. And again, the trends show that on average, Americans are more welcoming of immigrants now than they were in 2016, and indeed far more than they were 20 years ago. And it's not just immigration on which you see these kinds of responses. If you look on trade, again, this is the Gallup data on trade, where in fact Americans are much more enthusiastic about trade now than they were, even prior to the 2008 financial crisis. Again, this is despite a president repeatedly hammering the notion that trade wars are good and easy to win. Similarly, with respect to specific agreements such as NAFTA, NAFTA has never been a terrifically popular agreement in the United States until Donald Trump got elected, at which point suddenly NAFTA becomes relatively popular. With respect to U.S. alliances, again, the idea is that rather than Donald Trump hammering about the fact that the United States somehow gets cheated on the cost of basing elsewhere, in fact, those bases have become more and not less popular with the American people. And then finally, even an organization like the United Nations, which is a nice proxy for multilateralism more generally, and generally speaking, one of the sort of political no-brainers in the United States is to just bash the United Nations if you're running for office. Even the United Nations has become more popular in the United States in the years since Donald Trump was elected. So Donald Trump has weirdly made liberal internationalism great again. And I think we should really thank him for this. Now, what explains this turn in the cycle? All right. And it's only a slight turn. We don't know how it's going to go. So there are some cynical stories and some hopeful stories I can give you. The cynical stories, and these should not be underestimated, is first, the sheer witless incompetence of the Trump administration. And I don't think I can underestimate the degree to which the Trump White House has badly handled a variety of public policy issues, both in foreign and domestic levels. And in fact, it is extremely telling to me how little the Trump White House has accomplished in its first 2 years in power, despite the fact that the GOP controlled the House and Senate as well as the White House. The second thing that can be driving this, and again, this is a little more credible, I think, is just sheer raw partisanship, which is to say, it might be that what you're seeing is not Democrats actually embracing concepts like free trade and immigration, but rather reacting to the fact that Donald Trump has opposed them. And so as a result, they have simply decided we are going to support these things because we don't like the person who's saying bad things about them. It is possible that they will change their mind if a Democrat actually winds up getting elected president. However, I do want to close on the notion that there might be a few more hopeful explanations for this. The first, and this is important in the United States, it bears repeating that populism was never actually that popular. Donald Trump won the election in 2016 by -3 million votes. And so as a result of this, it is far from clear that he is actually going to gain in popularity. Indeed, all of the polling evidence and all the electoral evidence suggests that his ideas have become less popular. And I would suggest that in some ways this has happened because finally the American people have gotten a view of the counterfactual. It was always easy as a candidate or as a critic of free trade or neoliberal policies to say, we can do better. We can impose protectionist barriers. We can build a wall, crowding out immigration. We can do all of these things and we will make America great again. It's one thing to say these things. It's another thing to see what those policies actually look like in terms of things like the tear gassing of citizens or of immigrants trying to come in at the border, or in terms of factories being shut down because barriers have been raised. And indeed, the very fact that the media narrative has shifted, that you're focusing on companies being shut down because of higher trade barriers rather than because of corporations moving to China, suggests that there might be that shift in public attitudes. And finally, I want to suggest that there might be some degree of adaptation to change. Part of what happened in the United States was there were two radical shocks that happened beginning about 15 years ago. The China shock in terms of China's opening up to the global economy, and also a significant wave of immigration that came into this country, that came into the United States. But both of those shocks have already happened. And in some ways you can argue Americans or human beings are relatively adaptable. And it might be the case that what we're seeing is the waning of that kind of reaction rather than the heightening of it. And I want to modestly suggest that all the phenomena that I talked about before might apply to Brexit as well, but again, not going to lecture to Europeans on this. So, what is still worth extrapolating? In other words, what are the trends that I think aren't going away that have to be acknowledged? The first is a growing rural-urban divide, not just in the United States, but I do think in Europe as well, in which, by and large, there's parts of the country that generally benefit from globalization are distinct from the parts of the country that are not. And as a result, this is leading not just to an economic divide, but potentially to a cultural divide as well. And this is something that I do think has to be addressed. The second is tighter fiscal and environmental constraints. I don't think it's really dawned on Americans just how bad the budget deficit and debt picture is in the United States. The economy is running extremely well, healthily right now, but it is highly unusual to have an economy doing this well and nonetheless running close to a $500 billion budget deficit. And that's with everything firing on all cylinders. God forbid what that deficit picture will look like when either interest rates go up or economic growth starts to slow down. I do think that, the response to waves of immigration will inevitably still be resistance. That's just the way that human beings, unfortunately, are hardwired. And I do think the questions of big tech are not going to go away anytime soon, and indeed, that's going to require active government regulation. So in terms of the future of democratic governance, I would argue that the last 5 or 10 years has been in one of reaction. Reaction to trends that people don't like, and as a result, a sort of impulsive turn towards people who say that these changes are not good and we can potentially do something better, usually by calling back to some sort of halcyon era that never actually existed in the real world. What I would want to suggest that we would see instead is actually a push towards genuine reform, an acknowledgement that the system led to certain mistakes, that led to the sort of rises of populist nationalism, but also can be made better. And I will simply close with this thought. In some ways, if you want to argue that, the sort of end of history thesis that Fukuyama put forward, it also gave rise to a genuine sense of complacency from myself, among others. The notion that the system was self-correcting, and that as a result, there didn't necessarily have to be that much done in the wake of, in terms of civic activism or active public policy making. I think if the last 5 to 10 years have taught us anything, It is that, in fact, the system can still work, but it actually requires genuine effort. It requires genuine political mobilization. It requires genuine discourse. And I'm hopeful that we will have that by the time we get to 2030. Thank you very much.